Most people think they lose control of their life in big moments. They imagine it happens after failure, after bad decisions, after years of inconsistency. But the truth is far quieter than that. Most people lose control long before any major mistake appears. They lose it in the first few minutes after waking up, when their mind is still open, still unguarded, still waiting for direction. And without realizing it, they hand that direction away before the day has even begun. You wake up and immediately reach for your phone. Notifications, messages, news, stress, noise, other people's priorities. Before you have even taken a full breath, your attention already belongs to the outside world. And because this habit feels normal, you never question what it is doing to you. But those first moments matter far more than most people understand, because the beginning of your day does not just influence your schedule, it influences your state of mind. A distracted beginning creates a distracted day. A rushed beginning creates a rushed mind. And a reactive morning slowly creates a reactive life. That is why so many people feel mentally exhausted before the day has barely started. Their mind never had a chance to settle into clarity. It immediately entered reaction mode. They spend the rest of the day trying to regain focus that was lost the moment they opened their eyes. And over time, this pattern becomes identity. They begin to believe they are naturally scattered, naturally inconsistent, naturally overwhelmed. But that is not their nature. It is their conditioning. There are people who seem calm under pressure, focused, clear, intentional. They move through life with a kind of quiet control that others admire. And most people assume those individuals simply have more discipline, more motivation, or fewer problems. But often the difference begins much earlier than anyone realizes. It begins in the morning. Because the morning is not just the start of your schedule, it is the psychological control point of your life. The first thoughts you allow into your mind shape everything that follows. They influence your emotions, your energy, your decisions, your patience, your focus, and your ability to handle pressure. What enters your mind first becomes the emotional atmosphere of the day. And once that atmosphere is established, most people unconsciously live inside it for hours. This is why the way you wake up matters more than the way you hustle. Most people are trying to improve their life while completely ignoring the mental state from which their actions are coming. They focus on productivity without first creating clarity. They focus on effort without first creating direction. And then they wonder why their progress feels inconsistent. But your life will always follow the condition of your mind. If your mornings begin in distraction, your days will feel fragmented. If your mornings begin in stress, your decisions will become reactive. But if your mornings begin in intention, your entire life begins to organize itself differently. And the powerful part is this: it does not require hours of routines, impossible discipline, or some extreme lifestyle. It begins with a few simple decisions repeated consistently. Small actions that seem insignificant at first, but slowly change the way you think, the way you act, and the way you move through the world. Because once you stop surrendering your mornings unconsciously, you stop surrendering your life unconsciously. And that is where everything starts to change. There exists a moment every morning that most people completely overlook. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. In fact, it happens so quietly that many never realize how much power it holds. It is the short space between waking up and allowing the world to enter your mind. And within that space, your entire day begins taking shape. Most people never claim that moment for themselves. They wake up and immediately react. They reach for stimulation before they reach for awareness. Their attention moves outward before they have established anything inward. And because this happens every single day, it begins to feel harmless, automatic, normal. But what becomes normal is not always healthy. Sometimes what feels ordinary is quietly destroying your clarity. The human mind is most impressionable in the first moments after waking, before stress fully returns, before responsibilities begin pulling at you, before distractions compete for your attention. Your mind is open in a way it rarely is later in the day. And whatever enters during that period carries unusual influence. Most people fill that space with noise. They absorb problems before purpose, urgency before direction, information before intention. And because of that, they spend the rest of the day emotionally reacting instead of mentally leading themselves. This is the reason many people feel mentally scattered even when they are working hard. It is not always because they lack discipline. Sometimes they simply never established control early enough. Their attention was already divided before their goals even had a chance to speak. A distracted morning creates emotional leakage throughout the entire day. Your focus weakens faster. Your patience disappears quicker. Small problems feel larger than they actually are. Decisions become harder because your mind is carrying too much unfinished mental noise. You begin reacting emotionally instead of thinking clearly. And slowly, you start believing life itself is chaotic, when in reality your internal state never had structure to begin with. This is why Napoleon Hill repeatedly emphasized definiteness of purpose, not because successful people never face distractions, but because they establish direction before distractions arrive. The average person wakes up and asks, "What do I have to deal with today?" The focused person wakes up and asks, "Who will I be today?" That difference changes everything, because once you establish your internal direction first, external events lose some of their power over you. Difficult situations may still appear, stress may still exist, unexpected interruptions may still happen, but your mind no longer belongs entirely to those circumstances. You already claimed ownership before the world tried to influence you. This is the first step of the morning routine that changes everything: mental possession. Before you check your phone, before you answer messages, before you consume information, you pause, even for a few minutes. And in those moments, you decide that your mind belongs to you first. Most people never do this. They allow random thoughts to shape their emotional state automatically. Old worries from yesterday immediately return. Anxiety begins speaking before intention does. Their mind starts drifting toward unfinished tasks, insecurity, comparison, frustration, fear. And because those thoughts arrive early, they quietly establish the emotional tone for the rest of the day. But the mind must be directed before it is disciplined. If you do not consciously choose your thoughts, habit will choose them for you. This is why successful people often appear calmer than everyone else, not because life is easier for them, but because they practice mental ownership before chaos begins. They understand something most people ignore. Attention is power. Where your attention goes repeatedly becomes the emotional direction of your life. If your attention constantly moves toward stress, your nervous system begins living in survival mode. If your attention constantly moves toward comparison, you slowly lose gratitude and confidence. If your attention constantly moves toward urgency, your life begins feeling like a permanent emergency. But when your attention moves toward clarity, intention, and purpose first thing in the morning, something begins changing internally. Your nervous system stabilizes. Your thoughts become more deliberate. You stop reacting to every emotional impulse. You begin operating from direction instead of emotional momentum. That shift alone changes more than people realize, because your life is not only shaped by major decisions, it is shaped by repeated emotional states. The person who spends years waking up in distraction slowly becomes someone who struggles to focus. The person who spends years waking up in stress slowly becomes someone who feels emotionally overwhelmed all the time. But the person who repeatedly begins the day with awareness slowly becomes someone who carries clarity naturally. This is how identity forms. Not through one dramatic breakthrough, but through small, repeated emotional patterns. That is why the first few minutes of the day matter so much. They are not isolated moments. They are identity training. And most people never notice this because the consequences happen gradually. There is no immediate collapse, no dramatic warning sign. They simply feel increasingly disconnected from themselves over time. More reactive, more emotionally exhausted, less focused, less intentional. And because modern life rewards constant stimulation, people mistake mental noise for productivity. They think being busy means they are progressing, but motion without direction creates exhaustion, not fulfillment. A person can spend an entire day moving quickly and still remain emotionally stuck. They can answer emails, attend meetings, complete tasks, stay occupied every hour, and still feel disconnected from their actual purpose. Because activity alone does not create progress. Direction creates progress. And direction must be established before distraction appears. That is why the first morning step is so powerful. Not because it changes your entire life instantly, but because it changes the condition from which your entire life operates. Instead of immediately consuming the world, you create space to establish yourself first. You breathe before reacting. You think before absorbing. You choose before responding. That may sound simple, but simplicity repeated consistently becomes transformation. The strongest people are not always the most talented. Often, they are simply the people who learned how to direct themselves before the world began pulling at them. They learned how to remain internally grounded while everything around them demanded reaction. And this changes the quality of every decision they make afterward, because when the mind begins in clarity, actions become cleaner, emotions become steadier, focus becomes stronger. Even discipline becomes easier because internal resistance decreases. You are no longer fighting yourself all day long. Most people try to control their behavior without first controlling their attention, but behavior follows attention. If your mind is scattered, your actions will eventually become scattered too. This is why waking up and immediately consuming external input is so dangerous psychologically. It trains your brain to become dependent on reaction. It conditions you to look outward for direction instead of inward for command. Over time, that creates a person who constantly feels mentally crowded. They struggle to sit still. They struggle to focus deeply. They struggle to think independently. They struggle to feel emotionally present because their attention is permanently fragmented. But once you reclaim those first moments of the morning, you begin reversing that conditioning. You stop beginning the day emotionally invaded. You begin the day mentally aligned. And that alignment changes the way you walk through the world. The second step of this morning routine is equally important: establishing definite direction. Once you have taken possession of your mind, you must decide where your energy will go. Most people wake up already mentally overwhelmed because they are carrying too many undefined priorities. Everything feels urgent because nothing has been intentionally organized. Their attention moves randomly from one demand to another, and by the end of the day they feel exhausted without feeling fulfilled. This is the hidden cost of living without clear direction. When purpose is unclear, distractions automatically become powerful. That is why people procrastinate so easily. Not always because they are lazy, but because their mind lacks a clear emotional target. Undefined days create scattered effort. Scattered effort creates inconsistent results. And inconsistent results slowly destroy confidence. The mind performs best when it knows where to focus. This is why high performers rarely begin their day emotionally improvising. They decide early what matters most. They establish priorities before distractions arrive. They do not allow urgency to define their entire existence. Because once urgency controls your attention, long-term purpose disappears. And this is what traps many people in survival mode for years. They become experts at reacting but strangers to intentional living. Every morning becomes damage control instead of direction. Every day feels full but emotionally empty. They work constantly, yet still feel behind because their energy is divided across too many competing demands. But the person who establishes direction early creates psychological order. They reduce mental friction because decisions become clearer. Instead of asking themselves all day what they should focus on, they already know. That clarity conserves emotional energy, and emotional energy is one of the most overlooked forms of power in modern life. Most people are not only physically tired, they are mentally overloaded from constant internal decision-making, endless reacting, endless switching, endless mental noise. But direction simplifies the mind. Once you know what matters, unnecessary distractions lose emotional authority over you. And that is when life slowly starts moving differently. Most people believe discipline is something emotional. They think disciplined people wake up every morning feeling motivated, inspired, and ready to conquer the day. But that belief is one of the biggest reasons so many people remain inconsistent, because motivation is unstable. It changes with mood, sleep, stress, emotions, weather, disappointment, and circumstances. If your life depends on motivation, your direction will constantly collapse. Real discipline is quieter than that. It is not emotional intensity. It is repeated alignment. And this is where the third step of the morning routine becomes powerful: reinforcement through repetition. The mind does not permanently change because of one good morning. It changes because of repeated emotional conditioning. What you repeat becomes familiar. What becomes familiar becomes natural. And eventually, what feels natural becomes identity. This is how people transform their lives without dramatic breakthroughs. Not through one perfect day, but through repeated direction. Every morning, you reinforce clarity instead of confusion. Your mind changes slightly. Every morning, you choose intention instead of reaction. Your nervous system changes slightly. Every morning, you repeat focus instead of distraction. Your identity changes slightly. At first, the results feel invisible. That is the stage where most people quit. They want immediate transformation, immediate confidence, immediate clarity, immediate emotional control. But internal rewiring rarely feels dramatic in the beginning. It feels repetitive, quiet, almost too small to matter. But never underestimate repeated emotional patterns. A person who spends years repeating distraction becomes distracted automatically. A person who spends years repeating self-discipline becomes disciplined automatically. Your habits are not random behaviors. They are emotional rehearsals of identity. This is why repetition matters more than intensity. Most people try to change themselves through emotional extremes. They become highly motivated for a few days, create unrealistic routines, overwhelm themselves with impossible expectations, then eventually collapse back into old patterns. And every time that happens, they damage trust in themselves a little more. Because inconsistency creates internal disappointment. You begin questioning your own promises. You stop believing yourself. You become emotionally cautious around your own goals because part of you expects yourself to quit again. That quiet loss of self-trust affects every area of life. You hesitate more. You overthink more. You delay decisions. You avoid commitment. You stop aiming high because you no longer trust your own follow-through. And this is exactly why small, repeated morning discipline matters psychologically. It rebuilds trust between you and yourself. Every morning you follow through, your identity strengthens. Every morning you direct your mind instead of drifting emotionally, you prove something internally. I can lead myself. That proof matters more than people realize. Confidence is not built through positive thinking alone. Confidence is built through evidence. When you repeatedly keep promises to yourself, even small ones, your nervous system slowly relaxes. You stop feeling internally divided. Your actions and intentions begin aligning. And that alignment creates emotional stability. Most people are emotionally exhausted because they are constantly fighting themselves internally. Part of them wants growth. Part of them wants comfort. Part of them wants discipline. Part of them wants distraction. And because there is no internal leadership, their mind keeps moving in different directions every day. But repetition creates internal order. Once the brain realizes a behavior is no longer optional, resistance begins decreasing. What once felt difficult starts feeling automatic. What once required effort starts requiring less emotional negotiation. This is the hidden power of routines. Not rigid perfection, not obsession, not extreme productivity, consistency. A consistent morning routine slowly teaches the brain that clarity comes first, focus comes first, direction comes first, and eventually your entire emotional baseline begins shifting. This is why successful people often appear calm under pressure. They trained their nervous system repeatedly. They practiced intentional thinking repeatedly. They strengthened focus repeatedly. And over time, that repetition became emotional stability. Meanwhile, most people allow their emotional state to be determined by circumstances every single morning. If something stressful happens, they become stressed. If something frustrating happens, they lose focus. If something unexpected happens, they emotionally spiral because there is no internal structure holding them steady. But structure creates resilience. The person who begins every morning intentionally develops a different relationship with difficulty. Problems still exist, but they no longer emotionally dominate the entire day. Stress still appears, but it does not completely hijack attention. But distractions still exist, but they lose some of their psychological control. Why? Because the mind already has direction before chaos arrives. That changes everything. This is also why the morning routine must remain simple. Most people fail because they try to transform their life through complexity, massive schedules, endless habits, impossible systems. But complexity creates resistance, and resistance destroys consistency. Simplicity repeated daily is far more powerful than intensity repeated occasionally. A person who spends 10 focused minutes every morning establishing clarity will eventually outperform someone who constantly waits for emotional motivation, because consistency compounds. The same way negative habits slowly shape identity, positive habits slowly reshape it too. One intentional morning does not change your life, but hundreds of intentional mornings absolutely will. This is how people become mentally stronger without even realizing it at first. They stop waking up emotionally scattered. They stop beginning the day in panic. They stop surrendering attention automatically. And slowly, they begin feeling different internally. More grounded, more focused, more emotionally stable, more self-directed. And once a person experiences that internal shift, they stop craving chaos the same way. They stop needing constant stimulation. They stop confusing urgency with importance. They stop living in permanent reaction mode because clarity becomes emotionally rewarding. This is one of the biggest shifts that happens through repetition. Your emotional preferences begin changing. At first, discipline feels uncomfortable and distraction feels pleasurable. Later, distraction starts feeling draining and discipline starts feeling peaceful. That is transformation. Not forcing yourself endlessly, but changing the emotional relationship you have with focus itself. And this affects every part of life. Your work improves because your attention improves. Your relationships improve because your emotional presence improves. Your confidence improves because your self-trust improves. Even your physical energy improves because mental chaos consumes enormous amounts of nervous system energy. Most people are not tired only from work. They are tired from internal fragmentation. Too many thoughts, too many distractions, too much emotional reacting, too little intentional stillness. That is why mornings matter so much psychologically. The way you begin the day becomes the emotional blueprint for how you experience life. If every morning begins in chaos, your nervous system adapts to chaos. If every morning begins in intentional focus, your nervous system adapts to focus, and eventually that repeated state becomes personality. This is why identity is not fixed. People often say things like, "I'm just not disciplined. I'm naturally distracted. I've always been inconsistent." But those are usually conditioned patterns, not permanent truths. Repeated behaviors create repeated emotional states. Repeated emotional states create identity. And identity creates future behavior. That cycle can work against you or for you. Most people unknowingly reinforce negative identity every morning. They wake up late, rush immediately, consume endless noise, react emotionally all day, procrastinate, lose focus, then repeat the cycle tomorrow. Over time, their brain begins accepting that pattern as who they are. But once you interrupt that cycle consistently, identity begins shifting. You stop seeing yourself as reactive. You stop seeing yourself as overwhelmed. You stop seeing yourself as someone controlled by circumstances. Instead, you begin seeing yourself as someone who can lead their own mind. That shift is life-changing. Because once identity changes, behavior becomes easier. A person who identifies as disciplined no longer debates every small action emotionally. A person who identifies as focused no longer constantly negotiates with distractions. A person who identifies as intentional naturally protects their attention differently. This is why repeated mornings matter more than occasional breakthroughs. The small moments are shaping you far more than the dramatic ones. And eventually, people around you begin noticing the difference too. They notice that you no longer react impulsively. They notice your emotional steadiness. They notice your clarity. They notice your consistency. And many will assume you suddenly became more confident. But confidence was not suddenly created. It was slowly built through repeated self-leadership. Every intentional morning became evidence. Every focused decision strengthened trust. Every act of consistency reinforced identity, until eventually discipline stopped feeling like force. It became who you are. And this is the moment where life truly begins moving differently. Not because the world suddenly became easier, but because you stopped approaching life from emotional disorder. You became internally aligned, and alignment creates power. When your thoughts, actions, priorities, and emotional state move in the same direction consistently, progress accelerates naturally. Internal resistance decreases. Mental noise weakens. Focus strengthens. Opportunities become easier to recognize because your attention is no longer permanently scattered. Most people miss opportunities because their mind is too distracted to recognize them. They are too emotionally overwhelmed to act clearly, too reactive to think long-term, too mentally exhausted to stay consistent. But the person who governs their mornings develops readiness, and readiness attracts progress, not magically, psychologically, because prepared people act faster. Focused people decide faster. Clear-minded people hesitate less. Emotionally grounded people recover from setbacks faster. That creates momentum, and momentum changes lives. Once momentum begins building, discipline becomes easier to sustain because results start reinforcing behavior. You feel the difference internally. Your days feel more controlled. Your attention feels stronger. Your emotions feel more stable. And because you experience those rewards directly, consistency becomes emotionally meaningful instead of emotionally exhausting. This is why the morning routine is not really about mornings. It is about identity. It is about leadership over your own mind. It is about refusing to begin every day unconsciously. It is about training yourself to operate from intention instead of reaction. And once that becomes your standard, life starts responding differently. Not because luck changed, not because circumstances disappeared, but because you changed the condition from which your entire life operates. In the end, most people spend years trying to change their life without ever changing the way their days begin. They search for better strategies, better opportunities, better motivation, better circumstances. But they continue waking up the same way every morning, distracted, rushed, reactive, mentally scattered, and then wonder why their life keeps feeling difficult to control. But your mornings are not separate from your future. They are creating it. The way you begin the day shapes the condition of your mind. The condition of your mind shapes your decisions. Your decisions shape your habits, and your habits slowly shape your identity. This is why small, repeated mornings eventually become an entire life direction. Most people underestimate this because the transformation is quiet. Nothing dramatic happens after one intentional morning. There is no instant breakthrough, no sudden perfection. But slowly, something begins changing inside you. Your mind becomes calmer. Your attention becomes stronger. Your emotions become steadier. You stop feeling like life is constantly pulling you in different directions. And eventually, you realize something important. You are no longer trying to regain control every day because you never surrendered it in the first place. That is the real power of this routine. Not productivity, not hustle, not perfection, control. The first step is taking possession of your mind before the world takes possession of it. Refusing to begin the day in automatic reaction. Refusing to immediately surrender your attention to noise, stress, urgency, and distraction. The second step is establishing clear direction, deciding what truly matters before the day begins, pulling you toward everything else, creating psychological order instead of emotional chaos. And the third step is repetition. Returning to these habits every morning until they stop feeling like effort and start becoming identity. Because what you repeat consistently becomes who you are. If you repeatedly begin your mornings distracted, you will slowly become distracted. If you repeatedly begin your mornings intentionally, you will slowly become intentional. Your identity is not created in one moment. It is created through repeated emotional patterns practiced daily. That is why discipline is not punishment. It is alignment. It is teaching your mind to move in the same direction long enough for your life to finally follow. Most people are waiting for external change before they change internally. They think they will become focused once life becomes easier. They think they will become disciplined once they feel motivated. They think they will become calm once stress disappears. But life rarely works that way. The people who seem most in control are usually the people who learned how to create internal order before external conditions improved. They learned how to direct themselves before circumstances directed them. And that is why they move differently through life. They are not perfect. They still experience stress. They still face problems. They still have difficult days. But they no longer begin every morning emotionally lost. They begin grounded, and grounding changes everything. Because when your mind begins in clarity, distractions lose power. When your mind begins in purpose, hesitation weakens. When your mind begins in emotional stability, pressure no longer controls you the same way. This is how life slowly starts working in your favor, not magically, not instantly, but through repeated alignment between your thoughts, your actions, and your direction. One intentional morning may not seem important, but repeated over months and years, those mornings become character. They become self-trust. They become emotional resilience. They become the quiet confidence of someone who knows how to lead themselves regardless of circumstances. And that kind of person becomes very difficult to stop. So tomorrow morning, before you reach for distraction, pause. Before the world enters your mind, claim your mind first. Before urgency begins pulling at your attention, establish your direction. And before life tells you who to become, decide for yourself. Because the first few minutes of your day are never small. They are training your identity. And once you learn how to govern those moments consistently, you stop living in reaction to life and start moving through life with intention, clarity, and control. That is when everything begins changing.